Chapter 16. In the afternoon, our judge came over and introduced himself. He told us he'd be going with us that night. About sundown, we piled in our buggy and drove a few miles downriver. I noticed other hunters doing the same thing. Everyone was trying to get away from the already hunted territory. It was dark by the time Grandpa stopped. I untied the ropes from my dogs. Little Ann reared up on me and whined. Old Dan walked off a few yards, stretched his body, and dragged his claws through that soft-bottomed soil. Opening his mouth, he let out one loud bawl and then disappeared in the thick timber. Little Ann was right on his heels. We took after them. Grandpa got nervous. He said to me, "Don't you think you ought to whoop to them?" I told him to wait a little while. There'd be plenty of time for whooping. He snorted and said he thought a hunter always whooped to his dogs. "I do, Grandpa," I said, "but not before they strike a trail." We walked on. Every now and then we would stop and listen. I could hear the loud snuffling of old Dan. Once we caught a glimpse of little Ann as she darted across an opening that was bathed in moonlight. She was as silent as a ghost and as quick as a flitting shadow. Papa said, "It sure is a beautiful night for hunting." The judge said, "You can't beat these Ozark Mountains tonight for beauty. I don't care where you go." Grandpa started to say something. His voice was drowned out by the bell-like cry of little Ann. In a whisper, I said, "Come on, Dan. Hurry up. Help her." As if in answer to my words, his deep voice hammered its way up through the river bottoms. I felt the blood tingling in my veins. That wonderful feeling that only a hunter knows crept over my body. Looking over at Grandpa, I said, "Now you can whoop." He jerked his hat off and throwed his head back. He let out a yell. It wasn't a whoop or a screech. It was about halfway in between, and everybody laughed. The coon was running upriver toward our campground. We turned and followed. I could tell by the dogs' voices that they were running side by side and were hot on the trail. Closing my eyes, I could almost see them running, bodies stretched to their fullest length, legs pounding up and down, white steam rolling from their hot breath in the frosty night. Grandpa got tangled up in some underbrush and lost his hat and spectacles. It took us a while to find the glasses. Papa said something about getting them wired on with baling wire. Grandpa snorted. The judge just laughed. The coon crossed the river and ran on upstream. Soon my dog went out of hearing distance. I told Papa we had better stay on our side of the river and keep going until we heard him again. 20 minutes later, we heard him coming back. We stopped. "I think they've crossed back to our side," I said. All at once, the voices of my dogs were drowned out by a loud roar. "What in the world was that?" Grandpa said. "I don't know," the judge said. "Reckon it was wind or thunder." About that time, we heard it again. The judge started laughing. "I know now what it is," he said. "Those hounds have run that coon right back by our camp. The noise we heard was the other hunters whooping to him." Everybody laughed. A few minutes later, I heard my dogs bawling treed. On reaching the tree, Papa ran his hand back up under his coat. He pulled out Grandpa's gun. "Well, that's a funny-looking gun," the judge said. "It's a 410 gauge pistol, isn't it?" "It's the very thing for this kind of work," Papa said. "You couldn't kill a coon with it if you tried, especially if you're using birdshot. All it's going to do is sting his hide a little." At the crack of the gun, the coon gave a loud squall and jumped. My dogs lost no time in killing him. We skinned the coon, and soon we were on our way again. The next time my dogs treed, they were across the river from us. Finding a riffle, we pulled off our shoes and started across. Grandpa very gingerly started picking his way. His tender old feet moved from one smooth rock to the other. Everything was fine until we reached midstream, where the current was much swifter. He stepped on a loose rock and it rolled, and down he went. As the cold river water touched his body, he let out a yell that could have been heard for miles. He looked so funny we couldn't keep from laughing. Papa and the judge helped him to his feet. Laughing every step of the way, we finally reached the other side. Grandpa kept going in his wet clothes until we reached the tree where the dogs were. After killing the coon, we built a large fire so Grandpa could dry his clothes. He'd get up as close to the fire as he could and turn this way and that. He looked so funny standing there with his long underwear just steaming. I started rolling with laughter. He looked over at me and snapped, "What's so funny?" "Nothing," I said. "Well, why you're laughing?" he said. At this remark, Papa and the judge laughed until their eyes watered. Mumbling and grumbling, Grandpa said, "If you fellows are as cold as I am, you wouldn't be laughing." We knew we shouldn't be laughing. but we could not help ourselves. The judge looked at his watch. "It's after 3 o'clock," he said. "Do you think they'll tree another one?" As if to throw the words back in the judge's face, old Dan opened up. I stood and whooped. "Ooh-wee! Get him, Dan! Get him! Put him up in that little tree!" It was a mad scramble. Grandpa tried to put his breeches on backwards. The judge and Papa ran to help him with his shoes. Each one tried to put a shoe on the wrong foot. I was laughing so hard I couldn't do anything. 100 yards from the fire, I realized we had forgotten the coonskins, and I ran back and got them. My dogs had jumped the coon in the swampland. He tore out the river bottoms. I could tell they were close to him by their fast bawling. All at once, their baying stopped. We stood still and listened. Old Dan bawled tree a few more times and then stopped. Grandpa asked, "What happened?" I told him the coon had probably pulled some kind of trick. Coming up to my dogs, we saw they were working up and down an old rail fence. We stood and watched. Every now and then, old Dan would rear up on a large hackberry tree that was standing about 7 feet from the fence and bawl treed. As yet, little Ann had not bawled the tree bark. We watched her. She was working everywhere. She climbed up the old rail fence and followed its zigzag course until she disappeared into the darkness. I told Pop I was sure the coon had walked the rail fence and in some way had fooled my dogs. Old Dan would keep coming back to the hackberry. He'd rear up and bawl tree. We'd walk up to him, looking the tree over. We could see that there wasn't any coon in it. The judge said, "Looks like he has them fooled." "Maybe you better call him off," Grandpa said. "We can go someplace else and hunt. We got to get one more coon, even if I have to tree it myself." For some reason, no one laughed at his remark. "It's almost daylight," Papa said. "Yes, that's what has me worried," I said. "We don't have time to do one more hunt. If we lose this, we're beat." Hearing the word beat, Grandpa began to fidget. He asked me, "What do you think happened? How'd that coon fool him?" "I don't know for sure," I said. "He walked the rail fence. The hackberry tree has something to do with this trick, but I don't know what." "Son," the judge said, "I wouldn't feel too badly if I were you. I've seen some of the best coon hounds fooled by a smart old coon." Regardless of all the discouraging talk, the love and belief I had in my little red hounds never faltered. I could see them now and then leaping over old logs, tearing through the underbrush, sniffing and searching for the lost trail. My heart swelled with pride. I whooped, urging them on. In a low voice, the judge said, "I'll say one thing. They don't give up easily." Birds began to chirp all around us. The sky took on a light gray color. Tiny dim stars were blinking the night away. "It looks like we're beat," Papa said. "It's getting daylight." At that moment, the loud, clear voice of a red-boned hound bawling tree rang through the river bottoms. It was the voice of little Ann. Sucking in a mouthful of air, I held it. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs. I closed my eyes tight and gritted my teeth to keep the tears from coming. "Let's go to him," Grandpa said. No, wait a minute," I said. "Why?" he asked. "Wait till old Dan gets there," I said. "It's daylight now, and if we walk up to the tree, the coon will jump out of it. It's hard to keep a coon up in the tree after daylight. Let's wait until old Dan gets there. Then if he jumps, he won't have a chance to get away." "The boy's right," the judge said. "It's hard to keep a coon in the tree after daybreak." Just then, we heard old Dan. His deep voice shattered the morning silence. Searching for the lost trail, he had crossed the fence and worked his way up onto an old field. Turning around, we saw him come. He was a red blur in the gray morning shadows. Coming to the rail fence, and without breaking his stride, he raised his body high into the air. About halfway over, and while still in the air, he bawled. Hitting the ground with a loud grunt, he ran past us. Everyone whooped to him. Ahead was a deep washout about 10 feet wide. On the other side was a canebrake. His long red body, stretched to its fullest length, seemed to float in the air as he sailed over it. We could hear the tall stalks rattling as he plowed his way through them. A bunch of sleepy snowbirds rose from the thick cane, flitted away, and settled in a row on the old rail fence. Nearing the tree, we could see it was a tall sycamore, and there high in the top was that coon. Grandpa threw a fit. He hopped around, whooping and hollering. He threw his old hat down on the ground and jumped up and down on it. And then he ran over, kissed little Ann right on the head. After we killed and skinned the coon, the judge said, "Let's walk back to that old fence. I think I know how the old fellow pulled his trick." Back at the fence, the judge stood and looked around for a few minutes. Smiling, he said, "Yep, that's how we did it." "How?" Grandpa asked. Still smiling, the judge said, "That old coon walked this rail fence, coming even with the black hackberry tree. He leapt up on its side and climbed up. Notice how the thick timber is around here? See that limb way up there in the top, the one that runs over and almost touches that sycamore?" We saw what he meant. "That coon walked out in that limb," he said, "leaped over and caught that sycamore limb. Repeated this over and over from tree to tree. He worked his way far out into the river bottoms. What I can't figure out is how that hound found him." Gazing at Little Ann, he shook his head and said, "I've been hunting coons and judging coons for over 40 years, but I've never ever seen anything like that." He looked at me. "Well, son," he said, "you've tied the leading teams. There's only one more night of eliminations. Even if some of them get more than 3 coons, you still be in the runoff. And from what I've seen here tonight, you have a good chance of winning that cup." I knew that Little Ann had scented the coon in the air, the same as she had the ghost coon. I walked over and knelt down by her side. The things I wanted to say to her, I couldn't for the knot in my throat, but I know she understood. As we came into the campground, the hunters came out of their tents and gathered around us. The judge held up the 3 big coon hides, and there was a roar from that crowd. One man said, "That's the most beautiful sight I've ever seen." "What was a beautiful sight?" Grandpa asked. "Well, last night those little red hounds brought that coon right through our camp." The judge said, "We figured they did when he heard the noise." Laughing, the man said, "We heard them when they ran up on the other side of the river, way up above where they crossed over. We could tell they were coming back, so we doused all the fires, and sure enough, they came right through this camp. Those 2 little hounds were 50 yards behind the coon, running side by side. Boy, they were picking them up and laying them down and bawling every time their feet touched the ground. I'll tell you, it was the prettiest sight I ever saw." When the judge started telling about the last coon Little Ann had treed, I took my dogs over to the tent and fed and watered them. After they had had their fill, I gave them a good rub down with a piece of gunny sack. Taking them out to the buggy, I tied them up. I stood and watched while they twisted around in the hay making their beds. That day I tried to get some sleep in our tent, but the soaking Grandpa had taken the river had given him a cold, causing him to snore. I have never heard such a racket in all my life. I'd have sworn he rattled the paper sacks in our grocery boxes. Taking a blanket, I went out to my dogs. Little Ann had wiggled up as close to old Dan as she could. Prying them apart, I laid myself right down between them and fell asleep. The last night of the elimination turned out like the second night. None of the judges turned in more than 2 hides. That day about noon, the owners of the other winning teams and I were called for a conference with the head judge. He said, "Gentlemen, the eliminations are over. Only 3 sets of hounds are left for the runoff. The winner of tonight's hunt will receive the gold cup. If there's a tie for the championship, naturally there will be another runoff." He shook hands with each of us and wished us good luck. A tension began to build up in the camp. Here and there, hunters were standing in small groups talking. Others could be seen going in and out of the tents with rolls of money in their hands, and Grandpa was the busiest one of all. His voice could be heard all over the camp. Men were looking at me and talking in low tones, and I strutted like a turkey gobbler. That evening, while we were having supper, a hunter dropped by. He had a small box in his hand. Smiling, he said, "Everyone has agreed that we should have a jackpot for the winner. I've been picked to do the collecting." Grandpa said, "Well, you may as well leave it here now, son." Looking at me, the hunter said, "Son, I think almost every man in this base is hoping you win it. It's not going to be easy. You're going up against 4 of the finest hounds there are." Turning to my grandfather, he said, "Did you know the 2 big Walker hounds have won 4 gold cups?" Very seriously, Papa said, "You know I have 2 mules down on my place. One is almost as big as a barn. The other one is much bigger than a jackrabbit. But that little mule, it can outpull the big one every time." Smiling, the hunter turned to leave. He said, "You could be right." Papa asked me again where I thought we should start hunting. I had been thinking about it all day. "You remember where we jumped the last coon in the swamp?" Papa said, "Yes." "Well, the way I figure, more than 1 coon lives in that swamp," I said. It's a good place for them, and there are lots of crawfish and minnows in those potholes. If a hound jumps one there, he has a good chance to tree him. And Papa asked me why. It's a long way back to the river and about the same distance to those mountains, I said. Either way he runs, the dog can get pretty close to him, and so he would have to take to the tree. That evening we climbed into Grandpa's buggy and headed for the swamp. It was dark by the time we reached it. Grandpa handed Papa his gun, saying, "You're getting to be a pretty good shot with this thing." "I hope I get to shoot a lot tonight," Papa said. Under my breath I said, "I do too." After untying the ropes from my dogs, I held on to their collars for a minute. Pulling them up close, I knelt down and whispered, "This is the last night. I know you'll do your best." They seemed to understand and tugged at their collars. When I turned them loose, they started for the timber. And just as they reached the dark shadows, they stopped, turned around, and stared straight at me for just an instant. The judge saw their strange actions. Laying a hand on my shoulder, he asked, "What did they say, son?" I said nothing that anyone could understand, but I can feel that they know that this hunt is important. They know it just as well as you and I. It was little Ann who found the trail. And before the echo of her sharp cry had died away, old Dan's deep voice floated out of that swamp. "Well, let's go," Papa said eagerly. No. "Just wait a minute," I said. "Wait, why?" "To see which way he's going to run," I said. And that coon broke out of the swamp and headed for the river. Listening to my dogs, I could tell they were close to him. I said to Papa, "I don't think he'll ever make it to the river." They're right on his heels now. By the time we had circled the swamp, they were bawling treed. The judge said, "Boy, that was fast." I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. Looking at me, he smiled and nodded his head. Papa and I knew I had judged the coon perfectly. He didn't have time to reach the river or the mountains. My dog had treed the coon in a tall ash which stood about 50 yards from the river. I knew the 50 yards had saved us a good hour because he could have pulled trick after trick if he had gotten into that water. We spied the coon in the topmost branches. At the crack of the gun, he ran far out in a limb and jumped. He landed in another old fallen treetop. He scooted through it, coming out on the other side. He ran for the river. The tangled mass of limbs slowed my dogs, and they all but tore the treetop apart getting out of it. Coon was just one step ahead of them as they reached the river. We heard him hit the water. Running over, we stood and watched the fight. The coon was at home in the river. He crawled up on old Dan's head, trying to force him under. Before he could do it, little Ann reached up and pulled him off. In a scared voice, Papa said, "The water looks deep to me." "Maybe you'd better call him off," said the judge. "That's a big coon. He could drown one of them easily in that deep water." "Call him off," I said. "Why, you couldn't whip him off with a stick. There's no use for anyone to get scared. They know exactly what they're doing. I've seen this more times than one." Grandpa was scared and excited. He was jumping up and down, just a whooping and a hollering. Papa raised the gun to aim. I jumped and grabbed his arm. "Don't do that," I yelled. "You're sure to hit one of my dogs." Round and round in the deep water the fight went on. The coon climbed up on old Dan's head and sank his teeth in one of his long, tender ears. Old Dan bawled with pain. Little Ann swam in and caught one of the coon's hind legs in her mouth. She tried hard to pull him off. All three disappeared under the water, and I held my breath. The water churned and boiled. All three came to the top about the same time. The coon was between the bank where we were standing on and my dogs. He swam toward us. They caught him again just as he reached shore. He fought his way free and ran for a large sycamore. Old Dan caught him just as he started up, and I knew that was the end of the fight. After it was all over and the coon had been skinned, Grandpa said, "I hope we don't have to go through that again tonight. For a while I thought your dogs were goners." The judge said, "Well, have you ever seen that? Look over there." Old Dan was standing perfectly still with eyes closed and head hanging down. Little Ann was licking his cut and bleeding ears. "She always does that," I said. "If you'll watch when she gets done with him, he'll do the same for her." We stood and watched until they had finished doctoring each other. Then, trotting side by side, they disappeared into the darkness. We followed along, stopping now and then to listen.
Come on.